Hi, I'm Sheryl Spradling Summe. I am a historian, and I got hired to write this history of Homewood by a committee back in the late 90s, so it's been a real trip of the heart trying to learn as much as I can about Homewood.
Welcome to the Shades Cahaba Oral History Project. I'm your host, Sean Wright. When I decided to start an oral history of Shades Cahaba, I knew it would be difficult. Luckily, I was able to find the people that I could interview, and I have others who've become valuable resources for me. Now, what really turned things around and helped me to launch a podcast was coming across the book Homewood, A Life of a City. Now, when it comes to the history of Homewood, everything is spelled out for me in this book. I'm able to use the book to ask questions of the people I'm interviewing and to put together timelines and ideas for special episodes. Now, since the book has become such a valuable asset for me, I decided I wanted to find the author, Sheryl Spradling Summe, have her on the podcast, and thank her in person. Now, with assistance from mutual friends, I was able to track her down and I asked her to be on my podcast. We talked about Shades Cahaba throughout the show, but we also talked about the other schools in Homewood, how World War II affected Shades Cahaba, the fear of polio, and many other subjects. So sit back and enjoy the episode, and if you happen to have the book on your shelf, crack it open and follow along. Now let's get to the interview. Thanks very much for being with me today. I appreciate you coming here. So let's talk about this a little bit. What do you do right now? What are you doing today?
I teach middle school history at Advent Episcopal School downtown to 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, and I've been teaching history there for 30 years.
Oh, wow. At Advent, you've been there for 30 years. Mm-hmm. Now, my understanding is you didn't grow up in Birmingham or Alabama.
Correct.
Where'd you come from?
We moved here from Central Florida in about 1989 when our first child was born. We wanted to be somewhere else. We were in rural Florida, and we loved urban Birmingham. And I had sort of a fascination with Birmingham for a long time. I went to Troy State undergraduate and then Nashville and Vanderbilt for graduate school, so I was going up and down 65 or what there was of it then. And I always remember seeing Vulcan with his red light or green light and thinking that place is something's magical about that place. And of course, we come from where everything is very flat. So just being able to see the variations and the lights on the hills, and it just seems so cool. So the fact that we ended up here was a wonderful coincidence. And my kids grew up with Vulcan. When we first moved to town, we lived in Vestavia, and I used Broadway as a cut-through a lot to go to OLS. One of my children went to Mother's Day out there. And I just loved those houses. Back then, they were a little more affordable. They didn't look quite as fancy as they do now, but they were sweet and up. So many of them are up high. It seemed high to me, up off of the road. And then we fell in love with one of those that was for sale, so we moved here. So I couldn't believe I got the offer to write the history of Homewood. It just it came out of the blue, and I just couldn't believe I had that opportunity because I consider myself a historian as well as a teacher. I've written a couple other things, and so to have the opportunity to do this was just amazing.
Well, this book that we're talking about, and I think some of the people might not know what it is, it's called Homewood, The Life of a City, and this was published in 2001. You worked on it in the late 90s. It was published by the Friends of the Homewood Library. It is a really great book. If you grew up in Homewood, if you've been here all your lives, there's a chance that this is on your shelf and you forgot about it.
Or it should be, or somebody who has it.
Right,
and borrow it because there are parts that you'll just love.
Well, I did not have a copy, and I asked my parents for it, and they were like, oh, yeah, we got a copy. And we looked and couldn't find it. And then after I was months into this project, I started looking around in my house, and we were rearranging some books, and there was a copy. It might be my parents' copy, but they are not getting it back. So it's mine from now on. But it's a great book. It's got the history of Homewood. It's got, my favorite part is actually the map in the back of Homewood from, what year is that? Probably
1929, I think.
Yeah, it's a fold-out map, and I love maps, and I love to see where things are and things like that. So, and the reason why I asked Sheryl to be here was because my project could not have started without this book. It would have been much more difficult. This was a great starting point. It had some really good information in there. It actually was really the basis for the Lunchroom Ladies podcast, where we had to learn about Ida Tyler, and we put some things together and figured
Ida Tyler's roles.
Yeah.
I feel like I had them. I didn't, but I heard so much about them.
It's a great book. If you don't have one, I don't know where you can get it. Hopefully we can maybe one day get a Kindle out of this or something like that.
It's sold out, so to speak. You can find it on the internet, but it's way overpriced.
Yeah. But how did this book start? What was kind of the, I guess, the originators, the people in charge? What were they thinking?
Well, I love that you said it was a starting place for your interest in Shades Cahaba history, because that's the way it was conceived. The young adult librarian here at the Homewood Public Library was frustrated because she would have students come to her all the time and say, I need to do a report on something related to Homewood history. And then there was just no source that you could go to that would send you then where you needed to be. And a book like this, hopefully that's what it does. You can go straight to the index and find what you're interested in, and then you can see the sources that we used and go to those sources if you need to. Ann Scott was her name, and she and a couple other local Homewood historians, Ann Wheeler and Glenn Wheeler, together with Ann Scott, formed a committee and got permission from the city to start looking for someone to write the book. And I think they had a fairly small handful of people they knew were interested. One person wanted to do an oral history project, and so they looked at that. But they read something else that I had written. I had a chapter published in a book about Alabama women's history, and it's called Stepping Out of the Shadows. And there had been a book signing about the same time they were thinking about doing this, so they noticed that book. They noticed that I was from Homewood. They read my part of it. They liked my approach, I guess. And so I was in the running and got interviewed and got the job, and it was amazing. And I'm a full-time teacher, and they agreed to work with me on a timeline that worked. So over like 3.5, 4 years instead of doing it in 1 or 2 years, since I could only work on it full-time in the summers. And had a wonderful head mistress at my school named Una Battles, who worked it out so that I could take Fridays off for one whole semester to sort of get me started on the research and get it going.
When they came up with this idea for the book, were their expectations different from what you ended up with?
No, I think they steered me a lot along the way, though. I have a tendency to be an old school, do the research and write it down, and not a lot of color. But they steered me a lot in that direction. And, of course, there were so many people that were willing to do interviews, and that's just color, like crazy. For example, Herb Griffin, who's just a doll. And he's one of many people that had sort of devoted themselves to collecting bits and pieces of Homewood history and pictures. So I had a ready source to go to with those people. And, thank God for people like that, because otherwise most of this stuff would have been lost along the way.
Herb was the first person I called when it came time to start this, because I knew he would have some good information, and I've gone back to him a couple of times to ask some things. And speaking of which, some of the things that I asked him, and one of the problems I've found with putting together this history, what I've done is I've started really with the history that you wrote, and then I've been trying to find other things and other little add-ons.
Branch out kind of.
Yeah, and one of the problems I'm running into is that everybody's memory is different than everybody else's. One of the examples is I'm trying to do a whole podcast on the owl, how it got up there, how it got off, how it returned where it was, and everybody's got a different story. I even know the people who lived on both sides of where this owl was up on Wellington Road.
When it was found in that lot.
Right. And their stories are completely different. So I'm really kind of having issues with that. So how did you deal with that?
Well, you sort of go back to the newspaper or whatever published source there was from the time as the definitive source. And they thought that the owl came down and it was going to be moved to put on Shades Valley High School, which seemed to be but then it sort of somehow got lost. Whether anybody stole it or not, who knows? You would never know. But you can start with the definitive source and then add those stories on the side. And it's funny when you look at the stuff as it all kind of shakes out in the end. And what this was, as I recall doing it, was so much information. My job was just to put it all together somehow, and that was kind of daunting. But once you start doing that, it shakes out in a way that just makes sense. And then you have stories like Herb Griffin and the accident where he was trying to rescue the dog and his leg got mangled by the streetcar. And then the Birmingham News put it in there as the dog saved boy story, which of course it wasn't exactly. It was kind of the other way around.
It does make a better story, though.
Right, but it almost doesn't matter. And, they have that picture of Herb and the dog in the hospital bed. And, it's just golden. So once you get the detailed structure of the story, those kinds of things are just there. And it almost doesn't even matter if they're super factually true, as long as you don't present them that way.
Right. Well, who helped you as you were going along? You talked about Herb. He was a great resource. He's popped up all through this book. But who are some of the other people, or how did they come about?
Well, let me make sure I give everybody credit. All right. I mentioned Ann Scott, who was the young adult librarian here at the Homewood Public Library. And I think she probably was the main impetus. And then, fortunately for Ann, and I'm sure she would agree with me, she hooked up with Annie Ford Wheeler and Glenn Wheeler, a couple who were historians in their own right and were retired and were able to contribute a lot of time to steering this project. So they were sort of my bosses. They hired me, and I would go to them when I had written a chapter, and they'd say, well, we're interested in you going ahead and doing some work on the schools or whatever the subject was. So they kind of steered me, which was wonderful because you have a fallback. They were called the History Committee. And they also then hooked me up with people that I wouldn't have known otherwise, since I didn't grow up in Homewood, who then hooked me up with other people, like Dolly Smith Davenport, who was the daughter of Theodore Smith, that was the nursery owner in Rosedale, Foliage Nursery, that Rosedale's named after because roses, and all the memories she has of her father, who was white, owning a lot of that land and then selling off parcels of it to his workers, many of whom were black. And that sort of becomes the beginning of the residential community of Rosedale. Things like that we just never would have realized. And Rosedale was actually briefly incorporated too, which we found very interesting, because who would have thought? We didn't know, but I just was scouring through old legislative records, and there it was.
Do you think that being an outsider, being somebody who did not grow up in Homewood, helped in this project?
I do. And I think probably at the very beginning, some of the people who were involved, Tommy West, there were a lot of people who were involved in helping this committee, were torn. They thought it might be better to have somebody who already knew a lot about Homewood history and was involved in it. For better or worse, they settled on me, but I do think it was sort of an advantage. I think it was an advantage for me in that I was able to have this big picture point of view. I wasn't more interested in one aspect of it than any other because I knew the same about all of it. And therefore, it is good to be able to use this as a resource, which is what everybody really wanted in the beginning. So.
I believe that's true, because I think, I'm focused on Shades Cahaba, but there's really great stories on Hall Kent and that whole section of town, which I've lived in. I lived in West Homewood and am interested in that. What did you get wrong in this book?
Oh, gosh, I hate to admit that. I know there are a couple errors. One in particular with the Homewood City Council members. There's so much information in the Homewood City Council notes, books and books and books. And we listed the Homewood City Council members as they were listed in the minutes right after the election, right after an election had been held. So it's possible that some elections were then redone, or there was a special election, or they got it wrong in the minutes, and we don't know that till after we had printed all the information. And I remember there was one family they were lovely, but they were a little disappointed that their forefather wasn't listed as a member, and they were right. When I went back and saw the way it had been put together in the minutes, I realized how we made the mistake. But newspapers, that killed me. But of course, they were lovely, and their family has a lot to do with Homewood history in other ways too. But and then there's another one. This is kind of an odd little thing. A gentleman came to my church recently and introduced himself, and I can't come up with his name right now, but his family was mentioned twice in the book. They were a Mayfair family, Mayfair residents, and his forefather was mentioned twice in two different places, and we didn't even realize it was the same person because a lot of names are similar.
Right.
But as it turns out, it was the same man, and the name was spelled two different ways, but we didn't think anything about it because we thought it was two different people. But little things like that, which I don't think, as much as they bother me, I think in the big picture, they're not as important. Because like I said, you can use the references to go back and do your own research if you want to find out more about something. For example, Shades Cahaba.
One of the things that I'm doing on shadescahabahistory.com is I'm having a special section called Sean Wright Was Wrong. And this is my way of making amends.
That's dangerous.
It's making amends for the mistakes I've made. Case in point, I got the principal's dates wrong on these banners. We did these large banners for the Shades Cahaba Centennial Celebration. R.B. Nichols and Lelton Cobb. I thought they had switched in the 60s, but it was like 1951. So I had to fess up. I'm fessing up and letting everyone know that is wrong, and we'll move on.
And
from
history
there.
is definitely one of those things where you're sticking your neck out, because at some point you have to say, this is what happened and this is when it happened. And that's always tricky.
Yeah, and there's always somebody who's going to show up.
That's right. When you're wrong, that's when they come out of the woodwork. But Shades Cahaba, I've been thinking about this since it's what you've been working on, is really special and unique in that it was elementary school and the high school for a long time. So it was really Homewood's only high school until 1970. Because when they went to Shades Valley, that wasn't distinctively Homewood.
Right.
So the people that have memories of the time it was a high school have that really special, we remember when and nobody else does feeling. And yet it's also this elementary school that's been there since 1920. So it also has the people who all feel connection to it, even though maybe they didn't go to school back then. Even if they went more recently. So it kind of has both of those connections for people. And I can see how it's turned into such a big deal, the 100th anniversary. That's awesome.
The people I've talked to who went to Shades Cahaba as a middle school or an elementary school and ended up going to Shades Valley early on, the vibe was completely different for them.
Right. It sounds that way from listening to some of the podcasts.
And I'm not sure what it is, because it was a big modern school. It wasn't any farther away really than Shades Cahaba is. There was something about it. Maybe even the attitude. We were talking about Herman Maxwell earlier, and we were talking about integrating the Homewood systems. And I had a teacher tell me that things were fine. Herman told me things were fine.
Right.
And he said that his sister caught hell at Shades Valley.
I remember hearing that and thinking, wow, that makes a lot of sense to me. But it's so, why?
Yeah.
And I thought the same thing, right, when I was writing about the hard times in Birmingham. And there were some ripples in Homewood, but it's not comparable at all.
Right.
It just seems like the community here was so much closer that people felt less threatened by each other, which makes sense. Birmingham being more metropolitan, having more workers come in from outside areas to compete for jobs, it kind of makes sense to me that there would be more conflict as a result of people just not instinctively knowing each other and being separated in different communities.
And I guess in that case, when you're speaking of Birmingham and the workers, not only did you have white and black separation, but you also had Italians and Greeks and Irish and whoever else that all had their own communities and were trying to compete for those same jobs.
Right. And Herman Maxwell sounds like such a great guy. He also had the experience from what y'all talked about in the podcast of being in that Rosedale School system, which was sort of informal, before it got absorbed into even Shades Cahaba. So, and it was such a small community that the people that were involved in educating there were their aunts and uncles and moms and dads. And B.M. Montgomery, who was the man who kind of gets credit for giving that education system some form in Rosedale, Must have been. I didn't know him, obviously. Must have been a master of bringing people together to get something done in a way that minimalizes conflict in such a small community. I think that would be tricky.
Right.
But obviously he did it well, because then the people that came from Rosedale into the Shades Cahaba School were already big believers that education is the most important thing. And so, right, they're all buying into the same priority at the school.
When I asked Herman about it, I asked him how did he handle integration. His mom's like, "You're just going to do this."
No sympathy.
Yeah, and
I love it.
I thought that was great. I was there. I guess I started Shades Cahaba 3 years or so after integration, and it blew my mind when I found out as a elementary school kid that blacks and whites did not go to school
Right.
together. That just blew my mind.
Oh, I know. I still, when I talk to my students about integration, and I was in Florida in public schools, the fact that we didn't even understand each other when we spoke at first completely because of different accents. Even minor accents like that develop within communities, and we just have never been together. Never. Not at the grocery store, not at the playground. And then in my experience, I was very fortunate, because then once we did get together, we found out we liked each other. But we didn't know going in. And I think the parent support that someone like Herman Maxwell had, and a lot of people had at Shades Cahaba, so that when you inevitably do get into conflict, you don't run home and have your parents say, "Oh, I feel sorry for you because of the situation." They say, man up.
Right. Rosedale School is a story on its own. I'd like to learn more about it. I don't know enough about it. And I think we mentioned earlier that the whole reason I'm doing the podcast is so I can learn some things. This is really a selfish podcast. It's all for me.
We forgive you.
So what are some of the things you've got way more in this book than Shades Cahaba? It's just a small part of the book. But what were some of the things that you remembered about it, the stories that you liked about Shades Cahaba?
Well, we've hit upon the owl and Ida Tyler's roles. Those were both impressive to me. Also, I think when you get into the World War II era, the way, and I don't know why I was surprised, I shouldn't have been surprised, that high school students were as much a part of that experience as older adults were, because they were right on the cusp of going or had brothers who went to war. Just the way that shaped the school during that time that they were students there, the seriousness of the purpose seemed interesting to me, because I've never had an experience like that as a student. I was a little too young to feel affected by Vietnam. So looking at high school students who, when I was a student, were so frivolous about so many things, they were so serious. And the way they used that purpose, pretty cool.
There were some photos of graduates in some of those 40s yearbook where it actually showed that somebody had graduated early and had gone into the service, and they were in their uniform as they were going on. There is also a display that they still have at Shades Cahaba. I asked the principal about it, and it was a bronze plaque for soldiers who had died in World War II who'd gone to Shades Cahaba. And it had been dedicated and put somewhere, but it had been pulled down somewhere in the past. It was actually in his office. And it's funny that we're talking about this. We're recording this 2 days before Veterans Day. And on Veterans Day, I will have had a podcast episode for veterans. And if you walk in the front door of Shades Cahaba, the owl door, that is, the old front door that I know of, when you walk in, the auditorium is straight ahead, and on both sides of that are listing of all the people who went to war, World War I, from the Shades Cahaba School District, which was a pretty large district.
Yes, it was.
They were all listed, people who died and people who survived. And those are listed there. And I think too often we walk past that and we don't see it. So on the show notes for that, our Veterans Day podcast, will be a listing of all the soldiers and also a listing of the soldiers who died in World War II as well.
Those lists are hard to put together. That's tricky, because that's the kind of thing, if you make a mistake.
Right.
It's just horrible. But there is a story about Clarence Lloyd Jr., whose father was one of the people instrumental in building Hollywood, was the first Hollywood mayor. And so, of course, they're involved in Shades Cahaba. And it's a picture of Clarence Lloyd Jr. and his nephew saluting. He's in his uniform, and he will die in a mission over France. But there's a lovely story about how the people in that village in France had honored his memory, and his family didn't even know about it. They found out. They went to France. There was a big ceremony where all the people, get choked up, all the people in this village just loved on these people and told them, we thank you so much, and we appreciate what he did so much. I mean, they literally found his plane and artifacts right in their neighborhood. And it just really repersonalizes those things that when it's been a while, it's easy to get lost in the time and the sameness of the stories. But when you start diving into the stories a little bit more deeply, they're not the same at all. And sometimes when I do readings from the book, I read this one part about the holiday season in 1944, 1945, and the knocks that came to doors, and we have the addresses, and they're Homewood addresses, and you still drive by them a lot, and those are the doors where the knocks came. And we describe these young men and describe their families, and it's really a privilege to be able to bring that to light. And then also it's sobering because I know that there are probably more stories that we didn't bring to light that also need to be told.
As I was looking through the yearbooks, I know the history. I know what happened. I know about the Depression that was coming, and I know about the World War II
It's
that was
weird
coming.
when you see it coming in the story, but they don't see it.
And they don't see it. And you're looking at these kids that are graduating, and you realize in the next year their lives are going to be completely changed.
One minute they're at Hamburger Heaven posing for a silly picture because they're a soda jerk at Hamburger Heaven, right?
Right.
And then the next minute that.
There's one story in particular. There were two athletes, two players who were going to go to the University of Alabama and play football.
Right.
And we're going to talk about them on a future podcast. But they were going to go, and it was right in the middle of the war. And I had to go and find out, did they actually make it? Did they get back? Did they actually get to play at Alabama? And they did, which was really nice for them, but it could have been so different.
Right, right. And it makes you wonder how much more you appreciate when we think of our veterans. And I say our veterans like they're sort of this entity that's not human, you know.
Right.
But the way it shaped their lives with this sense of gratitude that they were able to contribute and keep their lives, and they're very aware of the people they knew that didn't. To change the subject, then there's another period in this story, the story of Homewood and people that went to Shades Cahaba and then also went on to Shades Valley High School, but thinking about the polio epidemics that came through Homewood. And that was something I hadn't given a lot of thought to till I started interviewing people. And this one lovely lady who we interviewed, her name was Ann Connolly Logan. Ann Logan was her maiden name. And she recalled in the 30s, and we have the statistics about what happened in the 30s and things that Homewood did. They actually had free sprayings for kids. Kids would come in and they would spray them with antiseptic. You know, they were just trying to think of any way, right? Any way that they could forestall this. But one summer, I'm trying to look at the year, I don't know, it was in the 30s, maybe 1936, I think. The parents that had their kids home from school wouldn't let their kids go out and play that whole summer because they were terrified. But Manhattan Street, which is over right behind the park, Ann Logan lived on one side of the street, and her friend, Emily Putnam, lived on the other side of the street, and they would put notes in the lunchbox and throw it back and forth across the street. And then sometimes like a cookie or whatever, and that's kind of the way they maintained their friendship that summer. And I think about the parents being so terrified.
That's what I was just thinking.
Of this specter, you know, hanging over their children, and yet the children are more concerned with passing notes and cookies. And,
well, I was just thinking the other day, we were like, oh my God, we have not gotten our flu shots for our children. We got to get the flu shots. And that's, even as bad as that can be, that's nothing like what was going through their minds with polio,
right.
and they didn't know how to fix it. Or
And I guess, everybody who's a parent relates to that fear when you think about what that fear must have been like. And it brings you right back to this close connection you have with people who lived a long time ago,
Right.
but they lived in this same place. And it makes you aware of our common humanity, if that doesn't sound like too fancy a term, which is what I love about studying history. Completely.
And also, if they were living on Manhattan, you also had people coming in on the trolley car in front of their house,
right.
and who knows what those people were bringing.
Right,
in,
right. So, and tossing the lunchbox back and forth and trying to avoid the trolley going by when you're going to be having to plan your lunchbox note throwing.
Can you imagine keeping your kids in all summer, not letting them go
No.
out and do things?
No. I can't even begin to imagine that. They had shut down the pool, of course, the public pools.
One of the stories that stuck out to me was early on. So Shades Cahaba, they started the school, and then they realized we need to feed these kids.
Yeah.
And this was before Ida Tyler. It was the lunchroom lady before her. The story is that they had lunch in the chemistry lab, and they pushed everything aside. But the thing that stood out to me was they had to go get the food.
Right, right.
And can you tell me anything about the difficulties of getting over the mountain?
Well, I know that there was the same gentleman that drove the school bus, which was a truck with soft sides, kind of, that made the trip up and down. They called him Uncle Ode. I think his last name was Lindsay. But he went down, up and down the mountain, bringing kids down. So he may have done some of those food runs also.
And this was the only place you could get to Birmingham was around Vulcan now.
Pig Trail, as
The
they
Pig
called
Trail,
it,
and it was it Pine Gap then?
Lone Pine Gap.
Lone
Yes,
Pine Gap.
Yes.
Which, if you've seen any of the pictures, was sketchy, to say the least.
For sure.
It's not what we know of now when we go flying around, the 4-lane that goes by Vulcan. There was the railroad tracks that went across the road, and just a small gap through there. So they were having to come up that mountain, probably it was dirt, and come down the other side.
I really think most of the groceries and those kinds of supplies that came in and out of Homewood came on Oxmoor Road and then through what is today Mountain Brook and Montevallo as far as bringing things in and out. Every once in a while you hear a story about the road that went where 31 is now, up over into Vestavia on Shades Mountain, was quite rough also. And during Prohibition, there were a couple of stories from people that remember hearing trucks with lots of bottles that rattled at night coming up and down that stretch, which is kind of interesting to think about.
Well, actually, it's funny that you bring that up because that's Highway 31. It comes past Lakeshore Rehabilitation Hospital, goes across Lakeshore Drive, close to the Armory, and winds its way up past those apartments up the mountain.
Hairpin curve.
So you take a right there to go to Homewood High School on South Lakeshore. And my son just completed an Eagle project there at the Homewood Forest Preserve.
Right.
There's a couple there, and I've been talking to people about that. And we've walked through the trails back there, and somebody just brought up, they said, oh, there's a still back there.
No.
So
awesome.
I have not seen it, but I know supposedly there's a still back there. I'm assuming it's still there. It might have rotted by now, but yeah, that would have been way out in the country as well.
Yes.
That would have been, and I guess that's a good portion of the lake would have been there at that time.
Yes, but the lake was starting already by that time. Well, I don't know. The lake kind of ebbed and flowed.
Right.
Literally. It was bigger at certain times and smaller and swampier at certain times, which is why they eventually ended up getting rid of it. It was really, from what people have told me, it was the fullest right around to the west, where the high school is, and to the west. And then a lot swampier from there over to the east, like where Brookwood Mall is.
Right, because the dam was over there, and you can actually see remnants of the dam still.
You can.
And if you've seen any of the aerial pictures, you can see that as well. And I know that they had to change it up a little bit because of the new Highway 31 bridge.
Yes.
They had to build that. And also when they built Brookwood Mall back in the day, they also had to straighten the creek because the creek meandered all over the place.
And where Brookwood Mall is now, there was the first city park with Shades Creek Park, which is kind of hard for me to imagine.
Yeah. And I believe the pictures are in the book, right?
There are a couple, and you can kind of see Hollywood Country Club in the background. Hollywood Country Club was where the Marriott Courtyard is, more or less, now. And Shades Cahaba, one more thing I remember just from looking through, has always had, before anybody else in the area, special education classes that are first rate, and mainstreaming of special education students. They were right on the forefront of that before any other schools in the area. And so that's a really nice heritage to be able to claim, too.
When I was there, Louis Levon was the principal, and I think that was a big thing that he did. And I remember in third grade, the special ed class being right across the hall from us.
And I don't know if there's any connection with the Exceptional Foundation, but the fact that Homewood still, especially this part of Homewood Central, with Shades Cahaba and the Exceptional Foundation, takes upon itself that mantle. And it kind of goes along with being family. You know, we take care of each other and we celebrate each other.
It's even that way nowadays, and you see they're integrated into the classrooms and all that. And that's a great legacy. I appreciate everything you've done. This book has been a godsend for me. It's fun. I haven't actually read it from front to back. I've been going through it, but I need to read it, and it's
sort of made to be read in pieces, so that's okay.
I appreciate it. It's helped out this podcast. It's what's going to drive me as I move forward. And I hope to find things that you've gotten wrong in here.
Well, I will not be back for the What Sheryl Got Wrong podcast.
Thank you for everything you've done. I appreciate it. I enjoyed spending some time with you and talking a little bit about Homewood. And thanks for being with us.
All right. Thank you.
The Shades Cahaba Oral History Project is sponsored by SeanWrightArt.com, featuring Shades Cahaba Oral History Project shirts, hoodies, and accessories. There are products featuring our exclusive Shades Cahaba Centennial logo, which is based on an Al yearbook image from the 1920s and 30s. But there are also sweatshirts and hoodies which feature an interlocking SC that was found on the basketball team jerseys from the 1920s. Products purchased in the store help us to offset the cost of producing and publishing this podcast. You can find a link to the store on the podcast homepage at shadescahabahistory.com. Subscribe to the show at Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you subscribe to your favorite podcasts. You can also listen directly on our website at shadescahabahistory.com. If you like the show, we would appreciate it if you would rate us at Apple Podcast and share the show with your friends.